Good evening. Let us look more carefully at what is happening here tonight. You have likely seen the headlines from the past 72 hours. Ukraine has struck deep into Russian territory, supply lines are fracturing, frontline units are reporting unprecedented attrition. But what you are watching is not a simple military reversal. What you are watching is the moment when Russia's entire strategic foundation begins to collapse, not because it was attacked more fiercely, but because the architecture that held it together was built on assumptions that are now demonstrably false. That is what this video is about. And if you have ever wondered why wars turn so suddenly, or why armies that seemed unbeatable begin to fracture, the next 11 minutes will show you exactly how that happens. The mainstream framing is straightforward. Ukraine is drones and missiles, Russia loses ammunition, loses soldiers, loses territory, more weapons, more desperation, more attrition. It is a story of resource depletion, but that is not the real story. The real story is about something far more structural, the collapse of Russia's command coherence. Russia went into this war believing it could sustain an indefinite conflict. That belief was wrong, and Ukraine did not defeat that belief through superior firepower. Ukraine defeated it by making the cost of staying wrong more expensive than the cost of changing strategy. Watch what happens when that inversion occurs. 3 weeks ago, Russian forces occupied 23,000 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. They controlled the Donbass corridor. They held multiple bridgeheads across the Dnieper. By conventional measures, Russia was winning. That was always the wrong measure. The right measure was this. At what cost? In October alone, Russian casualty estimates exceeded 50,000 personnel. That is not a sustainable rate. That is an unsustainable rate that appears sustainable only if you are Moscow and you are not counting accurately. The Kremlin spoke of special military operation objectives. It did not speak of the arithmetic. 50,000 soldiers per month equals 600,000 soldiers per year. Russia's entire active military is approximately 900,000. The math works for exactly 1 year. Then the math stops working. Ukraine understood this from the beginning. Ukraine did not try to defeat Russia militarily. Ukraine tried to make the cost of military victory so catastrophic that the entire decision-making structure would break. That requires something very specific. It requires that the person making the decision, Putin, sees that the cost is unbearable. But Putin does not see casualty reports the way American generals do. Putin sees power. Putin sees whether his control is threatened. For 18 months, his control was not threatened. His army was bleeding, but it was bleeding slowly enough that the narrative held, we are making progress, we are grinding them down, we are winning. That narrative is what collapsed in the past 8 weeks. Here is the first layer of what is actually happening. Look at the supply chain. Russia's logistics network was designed for Soviet-era deployments. Those deployments assumed friendly territory, good infrastructure, and railways. Ukraine has destroyed or neutralized every major railway corridor Russia could use. Ammunition is being transported now by truck across increasingly long distances. A shell that took 2 days to reach the front 6 months ago now takes 8 to 12 days. That creates a cascading effect. Units fire less because ammunition is scarce. Enemy strikes become more effective because defensive positions are thinner. Casualties rise because attrition accelerates. The entire system begins to operate on a knife edge. But supply is not the deepest layer. Control is. Russia's command structure is hierarchical in a way that makes it brittle. Decisions flow down from Moscow. But decisions made in Moscow do not reflect reality on the front line. A general in the Luhansk sector reports that he needs 10,000 replacement soldiers and 2,000 tons of ammunition monthly. Moscow calculates that sending 6,000 soldiers and 1,000 tons is acceptable losses because Moscow is thinking in terms of strategic goals, not tactical realities. The general in the field sees an impossible situation. He cannot defend his sector with 6,000 soldiers. He cannot maintain firepower with 1,000 tons. So what happens? He reports success anyway. He says the line is holding. He says the situation is manageable. Moscow believes him because Moscow's entire information structure is built on units reporting what Moscow wants to hear. This is called command incoherence. It is what kills armies. Now let us expand this lens. Ukraine is not destroying Russia through superior firepower. Ukraine is destroying Russia by making that command incoherence impossible to hide anymore. How? By striking Moscow itself. On 4 separate occasions in the past month, Ukraine has launched drone or missile strikes that reached Moscow's outskirts. These strikes killed no one important. They destroyed no critical infrastructure. They accomplished one thing and one thing only. They made it impossible for ordinary Russians, the middle class in Moscow apartments, the business people who still have some economic stake, to believe that this war is going well. When a drone lands 100 kilometers from the Kremlin, the narrative breaks. People do not think Ukraine is losing. They think Ukraine can reach Moscow. That changes everything politically. The second layer is this: Ukraine is not trying to win the war militarily. Ukraine is trying to win the war politically. And the target is not the Russian army. The target is the Russian state's ability to maintain coherence. Think about this sequence carefully. 6 months ago, Russia had momentum. Russia had casualties, yes, but Russia had land and Russia had narrative. 3 months ago, Russia had casualties and land, but the narrative was fraying. 1 month ago, Russia had casualties, land was stabilizing, but the narrative had shattered because Moscow itself was demonstrably under attack. That is a very specific threshold. When the capital becomes a target, the social contract shifts. People who were willing to support the war when it was over there become unwilling when it is here. Now we must look at the strategic trap that Russia walked into and understand why it cannot escape. Russia believed it could sustain this conflict indefinitely because Russia believed it could control the narrative indefinitely. Russia's state media is entirely controlled. No dissenting voice can be heard on television. That works perfectly if the facts support your narrative. It fails catastrophically when the facts contradict your narrative. And once the facts contradict it, once drones are landing near Moscow, once casualty figures become impossible to hide, once soldiers on leave are telling their families the war is unwinnable, the state media becomes useless. It is like telling the country the rain is not falling while everyone is soaking wet. Here is where the system becomes trapped. Russia cannot negotiate now because negotiation would be seen as weakness. Russia cannot escalate militarily because the military does not have the capacity. Russia cannot sustain the war at current attrition rates because the personnel pool is finite. Russia cannot scale back to a lower intensity conflict because that would be abandonment of the special military operation narrative. So what does Russia do? Russia does what trapped systems always do. It becomes more aggressive, more desperate, more unstable. You see this in the recent rhetoric. You see it in the threats against NATO. You see it in the escalation of domestic repression. These are not the actions of a winning system. These are the actions of a system that has become aware it is losing and is thrashing. The strategic reality underlying this is that Russia believed it could prosecute a conflict indefinitely. That belief was fundamentally wrong. Let me show you why. Russia's economy is smaller than Texas. Russia's defense budget is approximately $110 billion annually. Ukraine's military support from the United States alone has exceeded $140 billion. That means the conflict is being financed by an economy that is 17 times larger than Russia's. Russia cannot outspend this. Russia can only hope to outlast it politically, to convince the West that it will give up before Russia gives up. For 18 months, that strategy worked because the West was uncertain. The West was divided. The weapons flow was slow. But as of the past 8 weeks, that strategy has failed because Ukraine has demonstrated it will not surrender, and the West has demonstrated it will support Ukraine indefinitely. Russia is now in a position where both escape routes are closed. It cannot win militarily, and it cannot make the West abandon Ukraine. That is a trap. Let us go one level deeper. The casualty picture is far worse than the mainstream numbers suggest. Independent casualty estimates put Russian losses at 60,000 to 70,000 personnel per month over the past 8 weeks. That is not attrition. That is annihilation. At that rate, Russia would lose its entire standing army in a year. But Russia will not lose its entire standing army in a year, because long before that happens, the army will cease to function. You cannot replace officers faster than you lose them. You cannot maintain unit cohesion with 70% casualty rates. You cannot keep soldiers fighting when everyone in their unit has been killed twice. The structural failure comes before the mathematical limit. That is happening now. But here is the part most people miss. The attrition is not uniform. It is concentrated in the elite units. Russia's mechanized brigades, Russia's motorized rifle units, Russia's airborne formations, these are being shredded at catastrophic rates. Why? Because Russia abandoned defensive warfare. Russia is now conducting human wave assaults because Russia has run out of ammunition for artillery. That means Russia is trading elite soldiers for marginal territorial gains. That is a losing exchange rate. Once you start trading elite soldiers, you have already lost the war. You simply do not know it yet. Now let us pull the lens back and understand what larger pattern this belongs to. This is not new. This is the pattern of imperial collapse. History has seen this pattern before. The Soviet Union in Afghanistan, Napoleon in Russia, the Austro-Hungarian Empire in World War I. An imperial power believes it is strong because it has territory and military capacity. It discovers too late that strength is actually a function of coherence, of the ability of the center to make decisions and have them executed, of the ability of the state to maintain narrative and social support, of the ability to sustain costs indefinitely. The moment the cost becomes visible, the moment the narrative breaks, the moment the center loses the ability to enforce coherence, the empire begins to fragment. That is where Russia is now. Not militarily, politically, psychologically. The military breakdown is a symptom. The real collapse is happening in Moscow, in the decision-making structure, in the state apparatus that believed it could fight forever. Let us be specific about the timeline. 8 weeks ago, Russia still had coherence. The war was unpopular, yes, but it was contained. The state could still enforce the narrative. 6 weeks ago, the narrative began to crack. 4 weeks ago, Ukraine's deep strikes made the narrative impossible to maintain. 2 weeks ago, Russian military bloggers began saying publicly that the situation was catastrophic. 1 week ago, Russian business people began organizing. This week, the first signs of division within the military leadership appeared. That is the accelerating sequence of political collapse. The military collapse will follow. It always does. Now let us expand to the next layer. This war is being fought in 3 arenas simultaneously. The military arena, where both sides are experiencing terrible attrition. The political arena, where Russia is losing coherence and Ukraine is gaining legitimacy. And the global arena, where the entire character of international order is being challenged. Russia's strategy was always that the West would tire. The West would decide Ukraine is not worth the cost. The West would negotiate terms favorable to Russia. That strategy required that the West see Ukraine as weak. Ukraine has spent 8 weeks making that impossible. Every strike on Moscow, every successful drone operation, every defeated Russian attack, these are not military victories. These are political messages. The message is simple. Ukraine can fight indefinitely. Russia cannot. The West made the right bet by supporting Ukraine. That message is being heard in Washington, in NATO capitals, in Brussels, and it is reinforcing the commitment to support Ukraine. The strategy that was supposed to work has backfired catastrophically. Now let us move to the scenario space. What happens next? There are 3 realistic possibilities, and they are quite distinct. The first is that Russia recognizes the situation is unsustainable and attempts to negotiate from a position of strength before it loses the ability to negotiate at all. This would involve offering territorial concessions in exchange for a ceasefire and a lifting of sanctions. It would require Putin to frame this as a victory. We have degraded Ukraine's military. We have achieved our security objectives, even though the actual terms would be a retreat. This scenario requires that Putin chooses rationality over narrative, which is possible but unlikely given his entire decision-making structure. The timeline for this would be 4 to 8 weeks. The second scenario is that the attrition continues, the political situation in Russia deteriorates further, and at some point there is a change in Russian leadership or a change in Russian strategy that neither Putin nor his closest advisors control. This might be a military coup, it might be a palace coup, it might be a sudden shift in state institutions. The characteristic of this scenario is that it is chaotic and unpredictable. Russia would likely continue the war through the transition, making it more brutal and more destructive as the leadership situation becomes unclear. This scenario would play out over 2 to 4 months. The third scenario is that Russia escalates further. Russia uses chemical weapons on the battlefield. Russia strikes NATO infrastructure to test NATO's response. Russia conducts a major false flag operation and attempts to draw NATO into direct conflict. This scenario is catastrophically dangerous because it assumes that escalation can reverse the underlying situation. It cannot. Escalation can only destroy more, but it can happen. Russia has a history of doubling down. The timeline would be immediate to 8 weeks. The most likely scenario is a combination. Russia attempts to negotiate while simultaneously positioning for further escalation. The negotiations fail because Putin cannot accept the territorial losses they would require, and Russia shifts toward the second or third scenario. That is the base case. It puts us in a window where the trajectory is determined by how Russia's leadership responds to the recognition that it is losing, and recognition is the crucial word. Russia has not yet truly recognized it. Moscow still speaks as though victory is possible, but the evidence is becoming undeniable. What this war will do to the region is reshape it fundamentally. For 30 years, Russia has been the dominant power in Eastern Europe. That position is ending. Ukraine will survive this war. Ukraine's military will be degraded, but Ukraine's political will has been tempered by this conflict. Ukraine has learned that it can defeat Russia. That changes everything geopolitically. The countries on Russia's periphery, Poland, the Baltics, Moldova, they are watching this war and they are drawing a conclusion. Russia is not as strong as we thought. The West is as reliable as we hoped, and therefore we should move as close to NATO and the West as possible. Russia is losing Eastern Europe. That is the strategic consequence of this war. Not because it is losing battles, but because it is losing the belief in Russian strength that held the region in a sphere of influence. The consequence for the global order is equally significant. For the past 20 years, there has been a question hanging over the world. Can the United States and its allies enforce the international order? Can they prevent major powers from simply seizing territory by force? Russia has answered that question. Russia has demonstrated that if the West is divided or hesitant, territory can be seized. China is watching. China is drawing conclusions. North Korea is drawing conclusions. If Russia had succeeded in Ukraine, the message to every authoritarian power would have been clear. If you move decisively and pay the cost, you can reshape your region. Russia is failing. That changes the entire calculus. The message now is the international order holds because the countries that defend it are willing to defend it indefinitely. And now comes the deeper question. History will remember this war not as a victory for Ukraine, not as a defeat for Russia, but as the moment when the post-war international order became the only order available. For 30 years, great powers have been testing whether the international legal system has any teeth. Russia was the final test. Russia failed the test. That failure will resonate across the entire global system for the next 3 decades. Here is what you need to understand. The war is not ending because Ukraine is finally winning militarily. The war is ending because Russia's ability to sustain it politically is collapsing. Those are 2 different things. A war can end militarily very quickly. A war ending politically is much slower and much more destructive, but it is far more permanent. When Russia finally agrees to peace, whether it is 2 months from now or 18 months from now, it will be because the cost became visible to the Russian people, not because the Russian army was defeated. That is how empires lose wars. Not on the battlefield, in the capital, in the decision-making structure. In the moment when the people stop believing the narrative and the state loses the ability to enforce it. If this analysis of Russia's strategic collapse made you think about what you thought you knew before, if it challenged your assumptions about how wars actually turn, if it helped you see the deeper machinery of power and politics underneath the headlines, subscribe for ongoing analysis. We are moving through one of the most significant historical moments of your lifetime. The collapse of Russian power in Eastern Europe will reshape your world in ways that will become clear only in retrospect. The next video will examine where this war goes from here and what it means for China, for Europe, and for the balance of power in the world that is emerging. Subscribe now so you do not miss that analysis. And before you go, answer this. What do you think Russia will do when it finally recognizes it cannot win? Will it negotiate? Will it collapse? Or will it escalate? Leave that in the comments below. We read every single one, and the conversation we build here is what helps us find the next stories that matter. Good evening.